With the Hildebrandine Revolution in the 11th century, a deep tension, latent since the 5th century, developed between the claims to temporal ascendancy of the emperor and other secular rulers and the rival claims of the papacy to a plenitudo potestatis, to a fullness of power, secular as well as religious. Gregory had pronounced the legal supremacy of the Pope over all Christians and the legal supremacy of the clergy under the Pope over all secular authorities, so writes Berman. This tension came to a head in the early 14th century when the exiled Avignon Pope John XXII tried to intervene in a contested imperial election. The row rumbled on for over 20 years before finally coming to an end in 1347, with victory going to the side of the emperor, the imperial electors utterly repudiating the papal claim that the election of an emperor required papal confirmation. Apart from its practical effect on its immediate contemporaries and succeeding generations, the controversy produced two important political thinkers, the Italian Marsilius of Padua and the Englishman William of Ockham. Marsilius was born in the northern Italian city of Padua sometime between 1275 and 1280, shortly after the death of Thomas Aquinas. He studied medicine before becoming rector of the University of Paris, and medical analogies are replete in his writing. He wrote his most famous work, Defensor Pacis, the Defender of the Peace, in 1324. Although he is known almost exclusively for this work, he wrote some others that deserve attention. The most significant of these is his Defensor Minor, which is at once a recapitulation of some of the major themes of Defensor Pacis and contains some clarification and extension of its doctrines. Defensor Pacis was originally released into the public realm without any author's name attached to it, and it was several years before Marsilius was revealed to be its author, at which time he found it expedient to flee from Paris to the safety of the court of Louis of Bavaria at Nuremberg. Apart from some forays abroad with the Holy Roman Emperor, he spent the rest of his life as an advisor in the imperial court and died around the year 1343. Such is the fertility of Marsilius's ideas that he risks being all things to all men. His writings have been deemed to foreshadow participatory democracy, Marxism, liberalism, and republicanism. The political philosopher Alan Goworth remarks that the modern theory of sovereignty in its extreme Hobbesian and Rousseauian form derives from Marsilius. Marsilio's theory, writes George Sabine, is one of the most remarkable creations of medieval political thought and showed for the first time the subversive consequences to which a completely naturalistic interpretation of Aristotle might logically lead. And Alexander Dontrave notes, somewhat ironically, that the author of the Defensor Pacis has been hailed in turn as the announcer of most, if not of all, the doctrines which were to become the creative forces of the modern era, a precursor of the Reformation, a theorist of popular sovereignty and constitutional systems, a herald of the modern sovereign state, a rather curious and even incompatible assortment of doctrines. What kind of book, we may well ask, was it that could give rise to such a range of diverse judgments? Marsilius's ambition in his Defensor Pacis was to undermine as completely as possible any pretensions of the sacerdotium, the ecclesiastical hierarchy, in particular the Pope, to justifiably exercise control over the actions of the regnum, the secular leaders, in particular the Holy Roman Emperor. The first part of Defensor Pacis lays out the conditions for the stability and unity of secular communities as a preface to its second part, in which Marsilius comprehensively repudiates papal authority in secular affairs. In the quarrel between Pope and Emperor as to who was the supreme authority, Marsilius was not so much a supporter of the Emperor as an enemy of the Pope. His account of secular politics was taken from and was primarily applicable to the Italian city-states. He had no particular attachment to the empire except insofar as its activities affected the welfare of the Italian city-states, and he gives no clear indication of how the political theory developed in Defensor Pacis is to apply to the empire or even to less extensive political units such as the Kingdom of France. As was the case with the other city-states of northern Italy, Padua had a system of communal self-government that operated by means of a system of councils under an elected official from outside the city who administered the system of justice. Despite being nominally self-governing, Padua and other northern Italian cities found themselves caught in the middle of the quarrel between the Pope and the Emperor. If Marsilius's ambition had been realized, it might appear to have had the consequence of making the Church simply a department of state. To think like this is to run the risk of anachronism. It's important to be clear that the contest between the Sacerdotium and the Regnum wasn't a struggle between church and state as we now understand these terms. Secular rulers of Marsilius's time could hardly have imagined how they could manage without the church, and the church likewise would have found it hard to imagine how she could do without what we would now call the state. But to speak of the state in this context can be misleading, writes MacLelland. We speak of feudal societies rather than states because the idea of the state has come to be closely associated with the idea of sovereignty, and it is by no means clear that the medieval rulers were sovereign in anything like the ancient or modern senses. Moreover, in the 14th century, the idea of something like a national church was frankly inconceivable, just as inconceivable as a church deprived of any independent form of organization of its own. However, the inconceivable can become conceivable, and in the 17th century post-Reformation religious settlement, churches, Catholic and Protestant, did become in effect departments of state. Like many Protestants after him, writes Sabine, Marsilio was really in a position where he ought to have remitted all religious questions to private judgment and regarded the Church as a purely voluntary organization. But it is hardly surprising that he did not draw in the 14th century a conclusion which Protestants refused to draw in the 16th. Marsilius's theory was a kind of embryonic Erastianism, that being the theory that the state is superior to the church in ecclesiastical matters. This theory was later to come to the fore in England in the writings of Richard Hooker in his book On the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, and most notoriously in the Leviathan of Thomas Hobbes. Among Marsilian scholars, Alexander Dontrave seems the most disposed to characterizing him as a proto-Erastian, going so far as to claim that Marsilius's theory leads, in fact, to a complete absorption of the Church into the state. It is here, in my opinion, that we must look for the real modernism of Marsilius's position. If we are to see in it an anticipation of later systems and doctrines, it is certainly not the modern notion of religious liberty that we can find in it. It is much rather a notion which implies the most radical denial of any such liberty and expresses that complete subjection of the Church to the state which was to be the outcome of the Reformation in some countries of Europe. George MacLelland believes that the idea of statehood was lost when the classical world came to an end, and that it had to be reinvented again by Marsilius and others. I do not find this claim plausible, not least because I believe that the modern idea of statehood was not known to the classical world at all, so that when the state did eventually come into existence, it was not a matter of rediscovery, but a matter of invention ab initio. In any event, MacLelland is correct in his belief that in Marsilius's day, the state as we now know it didn't exist, and that it is important not to read Defensor Pacis as if it did. He writes, "It is easy to read the Defender of Peace from a modern secular angle and to imagine that in Marsilius's own day, truly sovereign states in the modern sense actually existed. Marsilius's own direct transposition of key political terms from the ancient to the medieval world compounds the likelihood of an anachronistically modern reading of the work." Marsilius's Defensor Pacis is just one rivulet in a torrent of writing on the rival claims of the Sacerdotium and the Regnum. He takes as a given the truthfulness of Christian revelation. He also takes as a given the core aspects of Aristotle's political thought. If Aristotle and Christian revelation appear to conflict, then one of them must be being misunderstood. If you take Aristotle as your starting point in politics, as Marsilius does, then in a case of apparent conflict, it must be that Christian revelation is being misunderstood. The structure of Defensor Pacis mirrors this priority among authorities. Aristotle in Part 1, Christian revelation in Part 2. To repeat, Marsilius does not call into question the truth of Christian revelation. He is not anti-religious. He is, however, anti-clerical. Whatever may be the ultimate truth of religion and its future consequences in another world, its effects in this world are matters for secular regulation. In his Defensor Pacis, we witness, for the first time in Christian Europe, a dramatic and radical secularization of politics. Sabine writes, "Such a separation of reason and faith is the direct ancestor of religious skepticism, and in its consequences amounts to a secularism which is both anti-Christian and anti-religious. The Church is a part of the secular state in every respect in which it affects temporal matters." Inasmuch as Marsilius had an immediate intellectual mentor, that mentor was Aristotle, especially those parts of the politics in which Aristotle discussed the causes of revolution and civil unrest. Of course, Aristotle could not have foreseen among the sources of civil dissension a transnational spiritual authority outside the polis, claiming an ultimate authority over secular rulers, but his general account of the causes of revolution and dissension, suitably modified, was applicable to the circumstances of 14th century Europe. When Aristotle's writings descended upon an astonished Europe in the 13th century, two extreme reactions to it were possible. On the one hand, to reject it totally as unnecessary, if not actually dangerous for the Christian community. On the other hand, to see it as a source of truth parallel to that of Christian revelation. The ground of Marsilius' theory was an attempt to recover and apply the Aristotelian conception of the polis as a self-sufficient political entity to the social and political circumstances of his time, although the temporal and psychic distance of his work from that of Aristotle and the inevitable formation of his ideas by the very different religious and political realities of his time make his ideas anything but a simple representation of Aristotelian ideas. Aristotle is not the only classical authority that Marsilius relies on. He appeals to Cicero's De Officiis to bolster his claim that men exist to serve one another. Following Cicero, he believes that justice not only implies the obvious duty to refrain from injuring others, a claim that libertarians will have no difficulty accepting, but also a positive obligation to protect others from harm, a claim that, if understood legally, no libertarian could accept. Human sociability implies the responsibility to eliminate antisocial beliefs and practices anywhere and everywhere. Marsilius held, as Machiavelli was to hold some hundreds of years later, that the papacy's claim to exercise supreme secular authority was the root cause of civil and political dissension in Italy. Among the many causes of strife, there is, he says, one singular and well-hidden cause under which the Roman Empire has laboured for a long time and labours still. Papal aggression is a major threat to human happiness, and so Marsilius believes that, on Ciceronian grounds, all have a Christian duty to resist papal infringements on secular authority. The Aristotelian conception of the polis is that it is the self-sufficient community, and this is Marsilius' point of departure in his reflection on politics. For Marsilius, the political community exists so that men may lead a life of sufficiency. The elements of the state are not just isolated and indistinct individuals, but functionally different parts making their contribution to the whole. If one or other of the parts gets out of order, then the whole suffers, as if it were a kind of sociological cancer. The condition in which all of the parts of the political community work together is peace, the primary function of the ruling part of the community being to prevent any disturbance of the peace or to restore peace when it has been disturbed. What's a life of sufficiency? For the most part, it is access to the material necessities for human life, a plain bourgeois desire for sufficient material tranquility to permit the smooth interchange of economic and social benefits, writes Morel. Marsilius does not mean by sufficiency what Aristotle means by the good life or Aquinas by the virtuous life. It is not the political community's job to make the good or virtuous life possible, except indirectly by taking care of the conditions that make possible the acquisition of basic material necessities upon which the good or virtuous life may supervene. The rulers of the political community provide peace and order so that men can provide for themselves the good things they can derive from nature. There's a refreshingly concrete air about what Marsilius takes as the aim of politics, a down-to-earth concentration on political life dictated by the material human conditions of economics, biology, and psychology. He doesn't reject any of the higher aims of life, he just doesn't see the cultivation of them as the direct task of the political community, and in this he stands in opposition to both St. Thomas and Aristotle. Marsilius accepts as his fundamental principle of human action that all men desire a sufficient life and avoid what is not conducive to this. He writes, "All men not deficient or otherwise impeded naturally desire a sufficient life, and by the same token shun and avoid those things that are harmful to them." And he endorses Cicero's claim in De Efficiis that the most basic purpose of all living creatures is self-preservation. Cicero had written, "All species of living creatures are endowed by nature with the capacity to protect their lives and their persons, to avoid things likely to harm them, and to seek out and procure all life's necessities such as food, hidden lairs, and the like." Marsilius takes the position that human beings are naturally sociable and cooperate to their mutual advantage in the formation and operation of an organized community. He writes, "For men gathered into a civil community in order to pursue their benefit and the sufficient life and to avoid their contraries, and therefore any convenience or inconvenience that can affect all ought to be known and heard by all, so that they can pursue their benefit and avoid its contrary." The original motivation for human association is mutual advantage that promotes individual self-interest. Something more than mere survival can be achieved in a community when we get differentiation of function and a division of labour. Marsilius has a more or less standard account of human beings as possessing capacities that fit them for a given specialization, but, unlike many other theorists, he does not believe that this specialization debars artisans or manual labourers from participating in some way in the political community. Niederman writes, "Marsilio insists that the intercommunication of functions required for the public welfare necessitates a politics of inclusion, and he thus construes citizenship in a remarkably extensive fashion. Citizenship is consequently conferred on a strictly functional basis, judged according to the usefulness of various human activities for the meeting of material human needs." Here, a libertarian might well ask, if the advantage of the individual is the end of human association, why is government necessary at all? Marsilius' answer to this question appears to be that in furtherance of their own interests, individuals are impelled to congregate, but, as a result of the very congregation, they are very likely to come into conflict with one another. Without laws and an executive power to enforce them, peace cannot be preserved.